Some moments, they don't just pass. They don't fade away like a distant memory. They don't soften with time. No. Some moments, they latch onto your soul. They echo in your mind at night. They follow you, like a shadow you can't escape. It's been 1 year. 1 year since that night. Since the night I realized that the man I married, the man I trusted with everything, wasn't who I thought he was. And me? I wasn't the woman I thought I was either. You think you know yourself. You think you know your limits, what you would and wouldn't do. But let me tell you something. You never truly know what you're capable of until you find yourself standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything. Until you feel something so forbidden, so wrong, but so intoxicating that you stop caring about consequences. My husband convinced me to help his boss. Simple, right? Harmless. Just a favor. But looking back, I should have known. I should have known by the way he brought it up, by the way he avoided my eyes when he asked me. I should have known by the way my skin tingled when his boss looked at me for the first time. I should have known by the way my husband watched. I want to tell you everything. But before I do, I need to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a situation that started off innocent, normal, even? But somehow, without realizing it, you were somewhere you never meant to be? Feeling things you never expected to feel? Tell me in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone in this. Because this is the story of how one decision, one moment, unraveled everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and desire. If you love shocking true stories like this, make sure you subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. If you had asked me back then, I would have told you that my marriage was fine. Not perfect, not exciting, but fine. And isn't that what happens after a while? The passion fades. The butterflies die. You settle into routines, into quiet conversations over dinner, into goodnight kisses that feel more like habit than desire. That's just life, right? That's marriage. That's what I told myself. Mark and I had been married for 8 years. 8 long, comfortable years. He wasn't a bad man. He was responsible, hardworking, dependable. The kind of man people respected. But somewhere along the way, between the late nights at work, the business trips, the quiet meals where we scrolled through our phones instead of talking, I started to feel invisible. I don't know when exactly it happened. Maybe it was the first time he forgot my birthday. Maybe it was the nights I laid beside him, listening to the sound of his breathing, wondering if he ever thought about me the way he used to. Maybe it was when he stopped touching me. Really touching me. Not the absent-minded peck on the cheek before leaving for work, but the kind of touch that makes you feel wanted. Needed. I told myself it was normal. That we had grown comfortable. That love changes over time. But deep down, I knew. I was lonely. And loneliness? It does strange things to a person. And then there was him. Mr. Carter. He wasn't just my husband's boss. He was the kind of man people paid attention to when he walked into a room. He had this presence. This quiet confidence that made you feel small and important all at the same time. He was older than Mark, but not old. Mid-40s, maybe. Sharp suit, watch that probably cost more than my car, a voice like smooth whiskey. And the way he looked at people, like he already knew what you were thinking before you even said a word. Mark admired him. Wanted to be like him. And maybe that's why he never seemed to mind the way Mr. Carter looked at me. The first time I met him was at one of Mark's company dinners. It was one of those upscale places, dim lighting, white tablecloths, waiters who looked at me like I didn't belong. I remember feeling out of place, awkward in a dress that I had second-guessed 100 times before we left the house. I wasn't used to attention. Not anymore. But when Mr. Carter introduced himself, shook my hand, held my gaze just a second too long. I felt it. That pull. That awareness. It was like he saw right through me. I should have looked away. I should have ignored the way my stomach tightened when he smiled. But I didn't. And neither did he. That was the beginning. Just a look, just a moment. Harmless, right? We lived in a beautiful house. At least, that's what people said. Big, modern, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But to me, it felt cold. Hollow. A house filled with expensive things, but missing the one thing that mattered. Mark was always working. Late meetings, business trips, phone calls that took him away even when he was sitting right beside me. I used to wait up for him. Used to ask him about his day, used to try. But after a while, you stop trying when you realize you're the only one who is. I should have seen it coming. I should have known that loneliness, that hunger to be seen, to be wanted, it makes you vulnerable. It makes you reckless. And when Mark came home one night, excitement in his voice, telling me that Mr. Carter needed a favor and that I should be the one to help. I should have said no. But I didn't. And that was the moment everything changed. I didn't know it yet, but that night, that conversation, it was the start of something I couldn't take back. The start of something that would unravel every piece of the woman I thought I was. Because when I said yes, I had no idea what I was really agreeing to. It started with a conversation. Just a conversation. Mark came home late, as usual. Tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, looking more like a man married to his work than a man married to me. I was in the kitchen, pretending to read something on my phone, pretending I wasn't waiting for him. He barely glanced at me before heading to the fridge, grabbing a beer. And then, just like that, he said it. "Mr. Carter needs a favor. I told him you could help." I frowned, not because I didn't want to help, but because it was strange. Mark never asked me for anything. Not like this. And certainly not when it came to his work. I wasn't part of that world, his world. Not anymore. What kind of favor? I asked, setting my phone down, suddenly paying attention. Mark leaned against the counter, took a slow sip of his beer, then shrugged like it was nothing. Just something small. His assistant had to leave town unexpectedly, and he needs someone to help organize a gathering at his place this weekend. A gathering. That's the word he used. Not a party. Not an event. A gathering. Like it was something exclusive, something different. Something private. I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to help. But why me? Why not someone else? Someone from his staff? I don't know, he just asked, Mark said. And I told him you'd be perfect for it. Perfect. That word clung to me like perfume, thick and lingering. When was the last time my husband had called me perfect for anything? When was the last time he looked at me like I was something more than just there? I should have asked more questions. I should have thought twice. But instead, I let the warmth of his approval settle into the hollow parts of me. I let myself believe, for just a second, that maybe this was his way of pulling me back in. Of including me in his world again. Of seeing me. So I said yes. The next morning, I got a text. An address. No explanation, no details, just a time and a place. Mr. Carter's estate. I stared at it for a long time. Something about it felt off. Like I was stepping into something I couldn't quite name. But I pushed the feeling away. Told myself I was overthinking. Told myself it was just a favor. But favors, they come with expectations, don't they? I should have said no. Mr. Carter's estate wasn't just a house. It was a statement. A massive, glass-fronted masterpiece tucked away behind iron gates, the kind of place that whispered power and control. The kind of place where people like me didn't belong. But when I stepped inside, he made me feel like I did. He was waiting for me. Standing near the bar, drink in hand, like he'd been expecting me, like he already knew I'd come. "I appreciate you doing this," he said, that smooth voice wrapping around me like silk. I knew Mark's wife would be capable. Capable? A strange word. Not kind, not sweet. Not beautiful. Capable. But the way he said it? It felt like something else entirely. He explained the details. Nothing complicated, coordinating, making sure everything was perfect, overseeing the small, exclusive guest list. It all sounded simple. Harmless. But then there was the way he watched me. The way he stood too close, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long. The way he said my name. And that was the moment I realized. I wasn't just here to help. I should have known. But the worst part? The part one still can't admit out loud. Somewhere deep down. I didn't want to stop it. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for validation. But when someone looks at you like you matter, like you're something worth paying attention to, something worth admiring, it does something to you. It wakes something up inside you that you didn't even realize had fallen asleep. Mr. Carter wasn't just polite. He wasn't just charming. He was intentional. Every glance, every word, every casual touch that lasted just a little too long, it was all deliberate. And the worst part? I noticed. I felt it. And I liked it. At first, I told myself it was nothing. That I was overthinking. That I was just imagining the way his gaze would flicker down to my lips when I spoke, the way his fingers would brush against mine when he handed me something. But the more time I spent around him, the harder it became to lie to myself. It had been years since someone looked at me like that. Since someone made me feel like I was something more than just there. And then there was Mark. Mark wasn't stupid. He wasn't blind. He saw it, the way Mr. Carter's attention lingered on me. The way I responded, even when I tried not to. He saw it all. And yet, he didn't say a word. I waited for him to react. To pull me aside and ask why Mr. Carter was always near me. To show even a flicker of jealousy. To remind me that I was his wife. But he never did. If anything, he seemed pleased. Like this was some kind of game that he had already decided the outcome of. And that's when the questions started creeping in. That's when the guilt started sinking its claws into me. Was this wrong? Should I feel guilty? My own husband didn't care, so why should I? But I did care. At least, I wanted to believe I did. I wanted to believe that I was still the kind of woman who knew right from wrong. That I was still the kind of woman who could stop herself before it was too late. But the problem with lines, with boundaries, is that once you start inching closer to them, they start to blur. I caught myself thinking about him when I wasn't supposed to. Remembering the way his voice sounded when he said my name. The way his hand rested on the small of my back when he guided me through a doorway. The way my skin burned where he touched me, even though it was innocent. Even though it wasn't. And it wasn't just me. He knew. He knew what he was doing to me. He knew the effect he had. And instead of stepping back, instead of keeping things professional, he pushed just a little further. Just enough to make me wonder how much further we could go before it became something we couldn't undo. He would find reasons to be near me. A comment, a compliment that felt just a little too personal. A touch on my shoulder that lingered longer than necessary. And I let it happen. I let it happen because for the first time in a long time, I felt something. I felt seen. And I hated it. I hated that I liked it. I hated that it made me feel alive. I hated that every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize anymore. But the worst part? The part one still can't say out loud. I didn't want it to stop. I should have walked away. I should have said something. But instead, I let it continue. I let myself believe that as long as nothing happened, as long as we never crossed that final line, I wasn't really doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew. I knew I was already too far gone. And once you let something like this in, it doesn't just go away. It started small. So small that I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening at all. A touch here, a look there. A comment that should have been harmless, but wasn't. "That color suits you," Mr. Carter said one evening, his voice smooth, deliberate. "You should wear it more often." Simple words. Innocent enough. But it wasn't the compliment that made my breath catch, it was the way he said it. The way his eyes traced the curve of my shoulder, the slow slide of his gaze down my arm, down to my hand resting on the counter. And then, the touch. Barely there. Just a brush of his fingers against mine, like an accident. Like nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I knew it. He knew it. And Mark saw it. He was standing in the doorway, watching. Not saying a word, just watching. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't quite name. Not anger. Not jealousy. Not even hurt. No, it was something else. Something that made my stomach twist. Curiosity. That was the moment the doubt started creeping in. That was the moment I realized something was wrong. I wasn't imagining it. Mark wasn't just ignoring what was happening between me and Mr. Carter, he was observing it. Allowing it. Encouraging it? I started noticing the way he looked at me, not the way a husband looks at his wife, but like I was something he was studying. Like I was part of some plan that only he understood. He would ask questions he never used to ask. How was your meeting with Mr. Carter? Did he say anything interesting today? You two seem to get along well, don't you? There was something deliberate about it. Something that made my skin prickle. Like he was waiting for me to say something specific. Like he wanted me to admit to something that hadn't even happened yet. And maybe that's what scared me the most. The fact that nothing had happened. Not really. Not yet. But the way Mark watched me, it was like he was waiting. Like he knew exactly where this was going before I did. I tried to shake it off. Tried to convince myself that I was overthinking. That Mark was just busy, distracted, that his behavior had nothing to do with me. But then there were the moments. The ones I couldn't ignore. The ones where Mr. Carter's presence was too close, too warm, too deliberate. Like the night he walked me to my car after a meeting at his estate. The driveway was quiet, the air thick with something unspoken. And just as I reached for the door handle, he leaned in, his voice low. You're different from what I expected, you know that? My fingers tightened around the handle. Expected? He didn't answer right away. Just smiled. That slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. Mark's a lucky man. Lucky. That word sat wrong in my chest. It didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like something else. A test. A challenge. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because for the first time, I felt it, really felt it. The pull between us. The air between us thick, charged. And instead of stepping away, I hesitated. That night, I lay in bed beside Mark, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what was happening. Trying to understand why my husband, who barely touched me anymore, barely spoke to me beyond pleasantries, seemed perfectly fine with another man giving me attention. More than fine. Almost expectant. I turned to him in the dark. Mark, do you trust me? He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he turned his head, looked at me, and smiled. Of course I do. It should have reassured me. It didn't. Because something about the way he said it made it sound like he already knew the ending to a story I hadn't even realized I was telling. I thought I had control. I thought this was harmless. I was wrong. It happened at a dinner party. An exclusive, invite-only affair at Mr. Carter's estate. The kind of evening where the wine never stopped flowing, where conversations carried an air of wealth and quiet power. Where people spoke in low voices, where glances meant more than words, where everything felt charged. I should have known something was going to happen that night. I should have felt it the moment I stepped into that house, wearing a dress I had bought on impulse, something softer, more fitted, more revealing than anything I usually wore. Something I had chosen without thinking about why I wanted to wear it. Or maybe I had known all along. A breath, slow and heavy, as if confessing a sin that can't be taken back. Mr. Carter found me almost immediately. He didn't greet me with words. Just a look. A slow drag of his eyes from my face to my hips, like he was committing me to memory. Like he had been waiting for me. Mark was standing just a few feet away, engaged in conversation with someone from work, but I felt his presence. I felt the weight of his gaze without even turning my head. And that was when I realized something that made my stomach twist. He was watching. Not just absent-mindedly, not like a husband who happened to glance at his wife across the room. No, he was watching me. Watching him. Watching us. And he didn't look angry. He didn't look jealous. He looked expectant. That was the moment it hit me. That was the moment the weight of all those quiet glances, those unspoken words, those little moments that seemed like nothing until they weren't, came crashing down on me like a wave. He wanted this. Mark wanted this to happen. I should have left right then. I should have grabbed my purse, made an excuse, walked out that door, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I let Mr. Carter lead me deeper into the party, through the crowd, past the laughter, past the champagne glasses clinking together. And when he leaned in close, his lips inches from my ear, his voice low, smooth, dangerous, I didn't pull away. "You look beautiful tonight," he murmured. My breath caught. My skin burned where his fingers brushed against my wrist. The air between us felt too warm, too thick, too charged with something I wasn't supposed to want. I should have stepped back. I should have reminded myself that this was my husband's boss. That my husband was here. That I was a married woman. But then I thought about Mark. About the way he had been looking at me. About the way he had been watching, waiting, knowing. And for the first time, I let myself ask the question I had been avoiding all along. What if he wanted this? What if this wasn't some accident, some coincidence? What if this was exactly what he had planned? What if, all this time, I had been playing a role in something I didn't even know I was a part of? I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet Mr. Carter's eyes. They were dark, unreadable, full of something I couldn't name. He didn't move closer. He didn't have to. He just waited. He was waiting for me to decide. And I didn't step away. That was the moment. Not the lingering glances. Not the whispered words. Not even the touches that should have never happened. That was the moment I crossed the line. Because the second I didn't step away, I knew. I had already betrayed him. Morning came too soon. I woke up before the sun. Before my body even registered that it was awake, my mind was already racing. Already drowning in the weight of the night before. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my pulse thudding against my skin. My mouth was dry, my stomach twisted in knots. The room felt too quiet, too still, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to admit what I had done. I betrayed him. And yet, I wasn't even sure who him was anymore. Mark was beside me, still asleep. Or at least, pretending to be. I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure about anything. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him. His face was relaxed, peaceful, as if nothing had changed. As if his wife hadn't stood too close to another man. As if she hadn't let herself be touched, hadn't leaned into something she should have pulled away from. As if he hadn't watched it all happen. My stomach twisted. I wanted him to wake up. I wanted him to roll over, see the guilt on my face, see the shame, and ask me why. Ask me what I had done. Ask me what I had felt. But he didn't. Instead, when his eyes finally opened, when he stretched and blinked at me like it was just another morning, all he did was smile. And in that moment, I knew. He knew. He had known all along. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't even surprised. He was satisfied. Like a game had played out exactly as he had expected. As if I had done exactly what he had wanted me to do. I felt sick. Used. Confused. Disgusted. But the worst part? The part that twisted in my gut like something rotting. Somewhere deep inside. I also felt exhilarated. I tried to act normal. I went through the motions, showered, got dressed, made coffee. But nothing felt normal. The house felt different. The air between Mark and me had shifted. Not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that could be felt. A new silence. A new understanding. He didn't bring it up. Not once. He didn't ask me about the dinner party. He didn't ask what I had done after the guests left, what time I had finally come to bed. He didn't ask if I had been thinking about Mr. Carter, even as I lay next to my husband, wide awake, my skin still burning from another man's touch. He didn't ask because he already knew. And the silence between us? It wasn't the silence of a secret waiting to be exposed. It was the silence of an agreement that neither of us had ever spoken out loud. I started noticing the way Mark looked at me differently. The way his eyes would linger on me like he was waiting for something. Like he was studying me, testing me, seeing how far I was willing to go. And suddenly, I found myself wondering if I had ever really known the man I married at all. But it didn't stop there. Because when Mark went to work, when I stepped outside, when I walked into the office where Mr. Carter's presence still clung to the air like a ghost, I noticed something else. The whispers. The lingering glances from people who had always ignored me before. The knowing smirks. The quiet conversations that seemed to stop the second I entered a room. Did they know? Was this planned from the start? Had I walked into something much bigger than just a moment of weakness? I thought I was in control. I thought this was my mistake to own. But I was wrong. Was I betrayed, or was I the betrayer? That question haunted me in the days that followed. It clung to me like a second skin, whispering in the quiet moments, in the spaces between thought and regret. I asked myself over and over, trying to find an answer that made sense, one that would make me feel less like I had been played and more like I had been in control. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. I had spent so much time blaming Mark for being distant, for making me feel invisible, for letting someone else notice me when he wouldn't. But what if I had been wrong? What if I had spent all those years assuming he wasn't paying attention, when in reality, he had been watching the entire time? The worst part wasn't that I had betrayed him. The worst part was that I couldn't tell if he considered it a betrayal at all. Because Mark never confronted me. Not once. Not the morning after. Not in the days that followed. Not even when I avoided his eyes, when I flinched at his touch, when I sat across from him at dinner and barely swallowed my food past the lump of guilt in my throat. He never asked me what I had done. He never asked if I had thought about Mr. Carter after that night, if I had replayed every touch, every word, every moment. Because he already knew. And that should have made it easier. That should have made me hate him. But it didn't. Because buried beneath the guilt, beneath the shame and the disgust at myself was something else. A question I didn't want to ask. A truth I didn't want to face. If it was so wrong, then why did it feel so good? I hated what happened. I hated the way it made me feel. The way it made me question myself, my marriage, my own morality. But I couldn't lie to myself. There was a part of me, a small, dark part, that had come alive that night. A part of me that had been buried under years of routine, of neglect, of loneliness. And now that it had been awakened, I didn't know if I could put it back to sleep. So I was left with a choice. Confront Mark. Demand answers. Ask him why he had watched me fall into another man's hands and done nothing to stop it. Ask him if this was his plan all along. If I had ever been anything more than a pawn in some game I didn't know I was playing. Or I could let it happen again. Because the way Mark looked at me now, the way his eyes lingered, the way he observed me like he was waiting for me to make the next move, it told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to stop me. And that meant, for the first time in a long time, I had power. I didn't know what scared me more. The fact that I had already crossed the line once. Or the fact that I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. So now, I have to ask you, what would you do in my place? If your husband, your own husband, stood by and watched as another man laid claim to parts of you that should have only belonged to him, would you feel betrayed? Or would you wonder if you had ever been his at all? Was this a setup from the start? Was I played like a piece on a chessboard, moved exactly where they wanted me? Or did I walk into it willingly, step by step, choice by choice, pretending I didn't know where it was leading? Was I betrayed, or was I complicit? I want to know what you think. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the lines blurred? Where right and wrong weren't so clear anymore? Where you felt yourself being pulled towards something you knew you shouldn't want, but you wanted it anyway? Tell me in the comments. Tell me I'm not alone in this. And if you love shocking, true stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me, this isn't the only story like this. And it won't be the last. Some betrayals aren't loud. Some don't come with screaming matches, broken plates, slammed doors. Some happen in silence. In the spaces between words. In the moments no one talks about. Some betrayals happen in a glance. In a touch. In a choice that, in the moment, feels so small, but changes everything. And the worst part? Sometimes, the betrayal isn't what someone does to you. Sometimes, the worst betrayals are the ones you let happen. The ones you tell yourself aren't real. The ones you never saw coming, until it was too late.